Yo, what is up, guys? Sam Bezak coming at you with a brand new Optimal Living podcast. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different. It's something I came up with called Lunchtime Lessons. It's basically just a way for me to bring you guys, the listeners and the viewers, some really cool information in short, hopefully easy ways to understand some pretty complex topics. I just want to bring you guys the latest research and information regarding different topics, ranging from resistance training, nutrition, and overall health. I also am hoping to try and bring something a little bit different to this channel. I know a lot of you have probably seen my YouTube channel, which also incorporates some video game stuff now too. But I really want to kind of bring up some old stuff that I'm used to be really interested in, which is primarily neuroscience, and I really want to talk to you guys and kind of understand what you guys are interested in terms of what the brain is and what it does, and I kind of want to tie all that together and really kind of bring some cool information about how the brain really affects your body and what it's really capable of doing. But I also want to get into some other science topics as well. So if you guys have some topics that you're interested in, please comment below this video. Send me a personal message on my YouTube page, on my Facebook, on my Twitter, whatever. Just let me know what you guys are interested in, and I can talk about it. So today, for the first lunchtime lesson with Sam, what we're going to be talking about today is a training style called concurrent training. Some of you may know what this is, some of you may not know what this is, but chances are you actually do if you think you don't. So when you take a look at like athletes, for instance, people who are like football players, long distance runners, baseball players, pretty much any athlete that plays outside, they are what is thought of as concurrent training athletes. Traditionally, it's the idea of needing to have a high level of endurance and a high level of strength, and you're training for strength typically to improve your athleticism. So that's in the traditional sense of concurrent training. But there happens to be a different style of concurrent training called the hybrid approach. Now, this approach was really popularized by a guy named Alex Viada of Complete Human Performance, and that's really who got me really interested in this sort of topic. He kind of laid out different ways to continue to be strong and to have a high level of endurance, and really inspired me to really want to become a hybrid athlete. So that's why I'm interested in this, and that's why I want to talk to you guys about it today. So those are the two real types of concurrent training. So when we take a look at concurrent training, what are really the problems that arise for a concurrent training athlete? Well, it's primarily the fact that when you train for strength and you train for endurance, there's this thing called interference. And what that means is that when you train for strength and when you train for endurance, they have differing adaptations that are a result of that training, and they interfere with each other, which can be a really big problem, especially for athletes. So the interesting thing about the way that you train, whether it be for strength or endurance, this training style really determines how things in your body called motor neurons actually fire. And this is one of the big adaptations that occurs from any sort of training. When you train for strength and explosiveness, it trains these motor neurons, which I'll get to in a second, to fire with a high rate and a really high frequency so that you can produce power output at a high rate and a high level. When you train for endurance, this endurance training trains these motor neurons in your body to fire at a slower rate and a lower frequency. What this does is it ensures that the muscle can contract for much longer and is much more resistant to fatigue. So let me get into like what a motor neuron actually is a little bit more. So these motor neurons, they start up in the brain, they go through the spinal cord, and then they what are called what is called innervate muscle fibers, and they innervate many muscle fibers. So what actually happens up at the top in the brain, you think about performing an action, whether that be strength or whether that be placing one foot in front of the next while you're running, and it sends something called an action potential down into the muscle, and it eventually causes the muscle to contract in a certain way. Well, based on the way that you're actually training, this determines how that motor neuron fires. Like I mentioned before, if you're training for strength and explosiveness, it trains this motor neuron to fire at a very high rate and a very high frequency so that you can produce power and you can be strong, you can be explosive. When you're training for endurance, typically, this style of training trains the motor neuron to fire at a much slower rate and a lower frequency. And this allows, again, the muscle to become resistant to fatigue. So enough about the neuromuscular adaptations. Let's take a look at what are the actual physical adaptations. So when you train like strength training or resistance training, what happens as an adaptation is typically you promote an increase in contractile components of the muscle, such as actin and myosin. These are what actually causes the muscle. So like when you're doing a bicep curl, this is what causes the muscle to curl the weight in the upward direction. Another adaptation is also like an increase in muscle size. This allows for more of those contractile components to actually be in the muscle. And the cool thing is that there does seem to be a direct correlation between muscle size and strength. But it really, again, depends on your style of training. When we take a look at endurance training really promotes like an increase in the number and the efficiency of what are in the muscle called mitochondria. So these are like organelles that really produce most of the cell's energy, which is really important for an endurance training athlete who needs to produce a lot of energy for a really long time. Making these mitochondria higher in number and efficiency really is the primary adaptation for endurance training athletes. So why is this a problem? Well, primarily because there's this idea that these adaptations are really conflicting. So consider this again, like how I had mentioned before. If you take like a bodybuilder or a weightlifter, they increase in the contractile components and the muscle fiber size so that they can have more of those contractile components. When you take a look at endurance athletes, they have this higher number of mitochondria and a higher efficiency of those mitochondria. One way that you can really look at this problem is if you have an increase in one of them, you have to have a subsequent decrease in the other. The thing is that there's only a certain amount of volume in a muscle fiber and in a cell, so having these competing adaptations really doesn't always pan out. So really, if you take a look here, if you have an increase in contractile components, such as like what a bodybuilder or a weightlifter have, you have a decrease in the mitochondrial number. That's just because you end up having a higher ratio of contractile components, because that's like what's really needed for being a bodybuilder. If you take the opposite and you have an endurance training athlete, they have a higher number of mitochondria in relation to the amount of muscle fiber that they have, really kind of opposite of somebody like a bodybuilder or a weightlifter. So considering this information, what is really the primary goal of concurrent training then? Well, as it turns out, if you probably could have guessed, the primary goal is to really try and minimize this interference effect and really optimize your adaptations. So you're trying to get the most out of your strength training sessions, you're trying to get the most out of your endurance training sessions, and you're trying to train in ways that really make sure that the adaptations you're getting from one or the other really don't interfere with each other. So that way you can adapt optimally for your goals. So in the nature of not keeping this stuff too long and too bogged down with information, I'm going to sign off. Next time, we're going to hit part 2 of concurrent training, and we're going to really dive into what are ways that you can combat this interference effect and what are things that are really best practices when you want to become a concurrent training athlete, whether that be in the sense of an athlete or in the sense of a hybrid approach such as I am. So thanks for listening, guys. Until next time, question everything. Sam out.